So again, if you're not familiar, this is session 2. So we're hoping that you saw session 1, but we are going to do a session 3 as well before you leave for June 30th at the end of the year. And the intent of that was to provide you with 2 organizing ideas that you would be able to then plan with, so that you're not feeling like you're scrambling last minute. When you come back in August, you have all the materials that you could use, and you could make a choice. We are going to say to you sort of upfront, we did learn a few things as we went through the first one. When we did the pilots, we had asked teachers to give us suggestions as to how they would like us to proceed. And we also had a look at the outcomes that you were covering in the pilot sessions. And we did start with living systems, and then we followed it with matter. We at one point talked about having, changing it up, but in actual fact, we have really learned that the order that we have it in is going to unpack a lot of the outcomes that you need to do in order, and they start to build on each other. So keeping in mind, in case you're not familiar, you no longer sort of teach science in a box. You're not going to be teaching sort of, here's my 5 topics in grade 2. And then when we're done grade 2, we can kind of wash our hands of it, because then they go to grade 3 and they would do something completely different. And that was typically the way we've had it for so many years. But that is not the case anymore. Your science now will run very much like your LA or your math does, where each grade, the previous grade, builds on concepts that you're going to need in your classroom, and you're going to build concepts that they're going to need when they go to the next grade. So it's very much a scaffolded approach and a spiral approach. So that means that we also will be telling you, even today, we're going to be launching into a little bit of review of what the grade 1s were going to be doing, so that you're really well aware of what a child should have landed at your doorstep with. Granted, they're doing some of those new pieces. Some people are doing the pilots already, but nonetheless, we just want you to know that here are some pieces that you may have to do a little bit of work on first, so that students understand the terminology that you're trying to unpack at grade 2. And we do the same thing for grade 3 and so on. So that's kind of how we're going to go through this. So let's begin, and we're going to start with our land acknowledgement, and we're going to do it in such a way that
what is Indigenous worldview?
What we're going to do is we try and also include maybe a short clip. We're not going to watch the whole thing. I'm going to fast forward it through part of it. We're going to watch a bit of a clip here that provides you with a little background information that actually really ties to the subject that we're about to unpack with you. So we'll always try and link the acknowledgement section, anything that we put in there, to make it as sort of real time for you as you're going through. We're going to ask you to mute yourselves. Feel free at any time to jump in and ask a question, whether you do that just by unmuting yourself and say, I have a question, or in the chat box, whatever works for you. But in the meantime, if you can stay muted, that we don't get any feedback, then that will be great. Okay, so we're going to watch just a bit of this video. I'm going to turn it on, and then I'll fast forward it through.
What is worldview in general? Why do Indigenous people care so much about the land? What makes Indigenous beliefs different? What is so special about Indigenous teachings? Understand about Indigenous worldview. So let's talk through the basics. The first thing you need to know about Indigenous worldview is what the heck worldview even means. Now, what is worldview? I know I already mentioned what worldview has to do with different perspectives on the world, but let's define it even further. A worldview is a collection of attitudes, values, stories, and expectations about the world around us. These inform our thoughts and our actions. Our worldview is expressed through ethics, religion, philosophy, beliefs, etc. Overall, worldview determines how people live and how it can be shaped in any number of things, including ancestry, community, and social structure. Worldview is also how we think about our relationship between ourselves and other living things. You have a worldview that shaped you and has determined your beliefs. In the same way, Indigenous people have a unique worldview that influences absolutely everything we do. By learning about Indigenous culture, traditions, practices, and teachings, you are engaging with an Indigenous worldview. So let's talk more about that. The second thing you need to know about Indigenous worldview is the fundamentals of this worldview. Now, what is an Indigenous worldview? The guiding principle of an Indigenous worldview is that all living things are connected. Appreciation for all living things is a prominent Indigenous value which comes directly from the Indigenous worldview. Indigenous people live their lives under the principle that all living things contribute to the circle of life equally and should be acknowledged and respected as such. Indigenous people believe that the connection to ourselves, to the Creator, to Mother Earth, and all living things are integral parts of existing. That is why the land and other natural life is so important to an Indigenous worldview. Understanding that all living things are connected and that everything plays an important role in the world is an integral element of an Indigenous worldview. These principles are what guide the teachings, beliefs, values, and practices of Indigenous communities. Now, the third thing you need to know about Indigenous worldview is how it differs from Western worldview. Now, how is Indigenous worldview different from Western worldview? Most commonly, Western worldview is based on the assumption that man is superior. Instead of all living things being equal, living things are structured in a hierarchy. An Indigenous worldview is based on the idea that humans are equally important to plants, animals, and all other living things. Western worldview traditionally treats humans as the top of the hierarchy and everything else falls below them, which shapes the way we treat plants, animals, and nature. This often leads to misusing, mistreating, or disrespecting other life because it labels humans as most important. Indigenous.
Okay, we're going to stop it there. So that gives you a sense of some pieces that really do tie very much into our study of living systems, and that we need to remember that students, all students in our classes, need to see themselves. So our Indigenous students also need us to have those conversations about exactly that was just said, that man is not always at the top, that there is a perspective in which we are all equally as important as the rock that's on the ground or the stars that are in the sky, the cosmos. So that's important for students to see. So let's finish off then on the spirit of reconciliation. We want to acknowledge that this gathering is taking place on traditional lands across the province of Alberta, home to many diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. We acknowledge that this land is a traditional meeting ground, giving voice to its original peoples and the story of creation of this country in a way that history has forgotten. Whoops. So I'll just talk a little bit about this, and then I'm going to turn it over to Ted. So your agendas will look very similar from one session that we do to another. Obviously, it's going to be different because we'll unpack an entire organizing idea with you for your grade. But really, we want to kind of structure them the same so that you, A, know what to expect, but B, we also have, as I said, we've learned as we went along that it's really important that we tie some of those little pieces that we were just sort of putting up front originally about concepts, about assessment, about how do we unpack the cusp. Those are really important. And I can't say it enough that what Ted will start, we're going to tag team back and forth, but when he starts off, those pieces are so important for you to connect to the resource piece that I give you, because they can't function separately. And that's the piece that we really want people to understand. So we are going to do it a little differently. We're not going to just have all my stuff at the end. We're going to be floating that all the way through and tying it together for you. Hopefully that will make it make more sense for you, and that you can see those connections that we're looking for. So we're going to start, and I'm going to start it off and let Ted take over from here.
Kind of remembered to take my mute off this time. Thanks, Chris. We're going to begin just with a little bit of a review of some key ideas that were presented in the first session. That was the recorded session that we have. Just in case some of you haven't seen it yet, we want you to kind of be able to follow along with this presentation because they're all structured around some similar ideas. One of them is that the way we're looking at this curriculum is through the phases of learning, lenses of the phases of learning. And this, if you've never seen this graphic before, it may appear to be complicated, but it's really not too bad. If you take a look, what we want to do is begin at the surface level of learning. That's where we learn the basic things. We learn the facts. We learn the skills, what they are, how they're, what steps are in the skills. That word concept is there. Chris has alluded to it many times, and we can't get away from that. In the past, we used the word perhaps scientific vocabulary, which is pretty much the same thing. So if you can think of the science vocabulary you have in your current science course, those are essentially probably concepts. The difference is that if you take a look at the graphic there underneath the surface level, you can see concept is two-dimensional, it's flat, and that would be akin to vocabulary, where it has a meaning, and we know the definition of it. But we know that when we have a concept and we want to really truly understand it, we have to find examples of it. So if a concept, for example, is impact, not only do students need to know what impact is, but they need to know what examples of impacts are, be able to demonstrate examples of an impact, distinguish maybe between positive and negative impacts. So you could see it's more than just knowing something, it's sort of finding examples of it. And that's still at the surface level. If we were to move to the deep level, what that is trying to demonstrate is that the understandings in our curriculum guide are essentially individual concepts put together in a statement. One example might be that human behavior, which is a concept, impacts, another concept, animals, another concept. And we can, so those three concepts are interconnected to come up with an understanding. You'll notice I have different colors underneath those cubes that are connected. That just represents different concepts. So for example, or contexts, excuse me. So for example, if we're taking a look at humans can impact animals, we may look at that in our household. That would be one context. Or maybe if you have an animal in your classroom, you may look at through that lens, through that context, and you deepen that understanding, and you take that understanding and you apply it to more and more, to kids get a really deep sense of that, and then you could transfer it to some really unfamiliar things. Maybe can humans impact animals in a national park in some way, and what are some examples of that? So going to that surface deep and transfers, how we're really going to organize our presentation. Just one other bit of review, and that's the idea of a concept. As I mentioned before, the concept, and that would be the next slide, Chris. A concept is essentially what we had as vocabulary. When you look at it, think about those scientific terms. What they are really are organizing ideas of one or two words. For example, fruit. Okay, it's got distinctive attributes. We know that a fruit has those attributes or characteristics which allows us to classify things as fruit, such as the pineapple, banana, orange, and apple. And there are multiple examples of fruit, and we can think of all kinds of other fruit that aren't in there that fit under the category of fruit. We could even take a look and get more specific and take a look at apple and say, well, that's a fairly specific concept, because we know underneath that we can have crab apples, Granny Smith apples, and all kinds of different apples. So concepts are essentially the way we do organize our world. Really, our whole mind is kind of like a schema that all these concepts and ideas are categories of information we create to organize the world, and they're all connected in some way. When we walk into a room, we don't go, oh, there is a chair and a stool and a coffee table. We say, oh, the room is furnished. It's got furniture in it. So concepts allow us to group things together and make connections between other concepts. They're essentially like file folders. When we open up a folder on our desktop, on our computers, we give it a name and we put things that have those attributes of it. It could be things like all the assessments, and anything that goes in that file fits the criteria of assessments. We can also see the idea of concepts come up when we play I Spy with My Little Eye. I spy with my little eye something that is round. We're really essentially choosing a concept with one criteria, a thing that is round. And of course, we look for the different examples in the room until someone gets it right. So that's essentially what a concept is. We take a look at concepts. We know that they can appear in various contexts in different ways. So we could take, for example, this image here. And if you look at it carefully, you may see certain sort of concepts come alive in this picture when you look at it. And I'm going to ask you just to take a moment and to see if what concepts come to mind to you when you look at this picture, and feel free to write them down in the chat so we can maybe share some of those thoughts a little bit. We'll give you a few seconds to jot down your concept if you recognize one in that picture. I can see a landform, for example. That would be a concept. Recycling, terrain, right? Trash, perfect. Recycling again. Garbage is a concept. It's not that good to really get into some specific ones, a general and specific one. Human impact, and environment, for sure. Human impact. Temperature change, absolutely. Weather, clouds, rocks, perfect. And when you look at those examples, you can sort of see that some are a little bit more specific and some are more general. And of course, the more general the concept, the more subject specific it is. So rock and rock formations is more specific in science and the geologic sciences, whereas landforms is pretty broad and general. It could show up maybe in social studies or in geography as well. So the more general that concept is, the more transferable it is from one course to the other, and more specific, the more nitty-gritty in the detail and dig deeper into the course itself. Thank you for sharing those. So given that, when you do look at your curriculum guide, and you look at it through the lens of concepts, you'll find stories pop out. And if you were to do that, and if you have one available to you, or you can look at the one on the screen, take a look at this section. This is really the first cusp line in the grade 2 living systems. You'll see, if you look at it through the lens of concepts, you'll see them kind of pop out at you. And if you do have a highlighter on a piece of paper on one, or if you can highlight it in your mind, you'll probably recognize something interesting when you start identifying all those concepts. So I'll give you just a few moments to look at those and see if you can recognize which of those things in the guiding question, the learning outcomes, and the cusps are some of the concepts in this cusp of the organizing idea. You may have, we're going to just go to the next slide that shows some of those concepts, and you can see the whole the whole cusp line and almost everything lights up, because yeah, this science curriculum is full of concepts. But when you look closely, you'll see many of them are repeated in the guiding question and the learning outcome, and repeated throughout the different cusps. And those give you an idea of some of those key ones that you really want to make sure that kids have a good handle on them. Some of those concepts, such as animals and plants, were developed in grade 1. As Chris said, we're not teaching in silos anymore. What's taught in one grade and it carries over and moves up the grades. And plants and animals are one of those concepts that we've really worked with in grade 1. New to grade 2 are things like life cycle, and you can see that repeated throughout this. So we know that plants, animals, life cycles are important ones. And what I've done for you is I pulled out what I would call anchoring concepts in this organizing idea. And that would be the next slide, Chris. Okay, this isn't the anchoring ideas, it comes after this. What I've done was I've taken a look at all the concepts in the organizing idea of grade 2 living systems and put them together in a concept map. You'll have this available to you in the resource package that accompanies the recording of this videotape within a day or so. But each organizing idea will provide you with one of these. They're hard to read maybe on the screen, but I'll just give you an example of what it sounds like when you read through it. I'll begin at the top where it says living things include plants and animals, which can have similarities in their offspring or children. Moving to the right, living things are impacted by humans depending on their relationship with the living things. Living things are affected by human behavior, which can be positive impacts, such as reducing recycling and so on. And this gives you kind of a good idea of what is fully in this organizing idea. It can also be good, you can chop them up and give them to your students later on to see if they can kind of put together different parts of this to demonstrate that they understand how these ideas are connected. Or you can use it as a tracking to see where you are in the course and what you've covered and next chunk you have to cover. So use it the way you wish. The idea here is that this is a science curriculum, not only full of science vocabulary, but we're going to call them concepts now, and they're all kind of connected to create a really broad understanding.
And I think the key that Ted has just said is that they're all connected. The curriculum lends itself to becoming a checklist. Yep, did this one, yeah, did this one, yeah, did this one. And that's not what we're looking for. We're really looking for How are those different components in each of your rows of cusps all connected to each other? So it's not about just saying, I did that row, I'm going to move on to the next one. We have to do the factual stuff, but we still need to make those connections.
This is a graphic that shows the entire living systems organizing ideas from grade 1 to grade 6. So we're not going to go through it through much detail. It is in the session 1 folder. If you go back to that, to the ARPD site or the CARC moving forward site, you'll find that folder in there with the complete document that shows the progressions for all the grades and all the concepts. But this is just there as an example that Chris mentioned earlier, that this is not just a one-off thing where we teach our grade and the next teacher teaches their grade. When you read the guiding questions and the learning outcomes, you'll find that in grade 1, we learned about animals and their needs and what they need to survive. In grade 2, we continue to learn about plants and animals and what they need in terms of their growth cycle. We get into life cycles, and we get into grade 3, plants and animals are growing in a life cycle, but they're also in a food chain, right? And so they're all, in a sense, kind of interconnected as we go along. And that document, again, is available further. It's for you. It's kind of hard to read on the screen, but just want to remind you that that's there to help you out. Now, I pulled out what I'm going to call anchoring concepts. They look like there's a lot in there. Some of them have been already covered in grade 1, such as animal, plant, and similarity. But there's some other ones that are kind of new and do have an impact on how this course is taken. So what we're going to do is take a look at how we can help students learn what these concepts are in a deep way. So not just their definition, but more about them, what are some examples, and eventually how they're connected. So really working and developing these concepts is what we do, again, at that surface level. So what we're going to do is run through a variety of different instructional strategies that are useful at that first level. The help me out, Chris.
Right.
Right. Yeah, go to the next slide there at the surface level. And so that's what this graphic's trying to show. So we're moving beyond just the definition of the concept to creating examples, non-examples, and exploring those concepts in new contexts, new different situations. So Chris, I believe you're going to begin taking a look at some of those approaches that we can use.
So when I'm sharing the resources with you and we're talking about surface level information, we all have to start with surface. We have to teach those foundational pieces. I can't ask you to connect ideas until you have all the facts behind you. And then you can start to put those pieces together. So again, I'm going to give you materials in the absence of us having a solid sort of resource right now to use for that. And we may not get one. What we want to do is give you enough information to do your planning. And that doesn't mean that you wouldn't go and search for some on your own, but I think we've got quite a bit for you to share, and that these will be available. So just a reminder that everything that we do with you today, this slide deck, will be available in one of two places. It'll be on the ARPDC site or on the Moving Forward curriculum site. So we'll show you both to make sure that you're clear on where to find your stuff. And card sort is a great one. And actually the living system, the whole basically unpacking of the living system, whether it's kindergarten or grade 1 or grade 6, the card sort is a great way. And I love using card sorts because it allows me to formatively assess where students are at. So I can give them a random number of cards. I can say simply sort them and not give them any rules and just see what they come up with. And then it's in the talk, in the explanation that they give me as to why did you put those things together, that I really get a sense of, oh, okay, yeah, they really got a good handle on this. They might need a little work on that. Or, okay, they're missing some foundational pieces here and I need to go back and do that. So a card sort is that. And we do have a card sort for you. What I'm going to do, and you'll see it says here grade 1, I'm going to share with you some of the card sorts that we used in grade 1, because there are some things that they learned in grade 1 that you will need to make sure they understand before you kind of launch into the grade 2 piece. And as Ted said, we already talked about plants and animals. So they started with living and non-living. So we simply give them a set of cards and we say, can you sort them into living and non-living? Let's see if they can figure out what that is without us doing direct teaching. I don't need to put definitions on the board and say, copy it in your book. I want to know, what do you know? And so from here, we can ask them, How did you know to put what you did in each of them? Without any judgment, let's see what the explanation is. How do they know living from non-living? And then I can pull out some of the things that they use in common language to start making connections that, oh, you're saying that all living things have this and that all non-living things had that. So I start to make those connections with the students. So what is the relationship between the things that you placed in the living column? What's the relationship between the pictures that you placed in the non-living column? What did they see? This is still surface level. There's nothing deep about this. This is just unpacking. Do they know the difference between living and non-living? So I haven't done anything really other than to check for understanding. I could use the same card sort and say to them, I would like you to resort them into plants and animals. Again, a pretty easy task for most students. But again, we want to hear what is their thinking about why they put them together. What did they see all the plants had in common? What did they think the animals had in common? Is there anything that plants and animals both had in common, right? Those are also good questions for us to ask. But that's the grade 1 piece. And so a little bit of that kind of work happening ahead of time with your grade 2s would be a good foundational start, just to make sure that they haven't missed anything. So plants and animals have similarities and differences. How could you describe or model that? So how could they describe? First of all, they need to know what a similarity is and what a difference is before I can ask that question. And Ted will unpack some of those skill procedures with you shortly. But those are important pieces for them. So you have access to those cards. As a grade 2 teacher, when you get into the file folders and you find materials, you can go to the grade 2 file, but you also can go access grade 1 materials. You can access grade 3 materials. You're not limited to just the materials that are there. But wherever possible, if we need to use them double, then I will put them in your folder as well. So another one would be, could you resort them again? We just said, can you resort them in a different rule? What's your rule? And so in this case, the students looked at this and we said, okay, how did you decide what went into each group? Asking those questions helps us to understand where they're at from their foundational levels. In this case, the students marked on the number of legs. So they said everything that was in here had 4 legs. Everything that was in here had 2 legs or 2 wings, either or, whichever they wanted to express it. This group had no legs and they didn't move. These are the plants. These ones had no legs, but they still moved, right? So now again, the students have had that opportunity for them to start thinking about how can I start to refine even the cards that I just had before and labeled them differently. The other one that I do like to use a lot is case studies. So in a case study, what I might do is I might read a story to a student. I might not teach them anything. We might just say, you know what, boys and girls, we're going to start with a story today. We read the story and then we start to unpack some of that question and say, what did we learn about living things or non-living things, depending on what the story was about? I used case studies in this one for grade 2, which I'll unpack for you later, because it was a great way to teach the students what we wanted them to see and model it for them before we said, now it's your turn to show us what you know. So in this case, I might have started in grade 1 with a story called I Know It's Living. The whole book is about living. So I could ask about, let's make a list. What did we learn about living things? Okay, even if I didn't do the card sort yet, maybe I just started with the story. This is just an approach that you can use. Or today I started a story, tomorrow I come back with a card sort. So I read the story, I ask them, what do they know about living? But the more important question would be, what do you think then we're going to say about what have we learned about non-living? Even though it wasn't in the book, what can we conclude? What can we predict? What will we think is true about non-living? So again, these are just sample ways that I might unpack it. That doesn't mean that's the way you have to do it. Just giving you some thoughts and ideas. The books that I have listed here, I've got referenced for you so you know where the authors are. They are not found on the New Learn Alberta site, but they are books that we found the first time around that were really good matches to the organizing ideas that you were unpacking. Okay, the Frayer model is another one, right? A Frayer model allows students to say, can you give me an example of something that is, in case maybe I say living, or can you give me an example of something that is not living? So yes and no is really what I'm looking for, is can they give me examples of both? Could they give me examples of human behavior? Could they give me example of something that was living, non-living, something that was an animal, not an animal, right? Just that simple kind of thing. And if they're not good at writing yet, and you're starting with this at the beginning of the year, then it gives them the opportunity to also draw a picture, and that they can show and explain to us what their understanding is. So in this case, I might say part of our organizing idea is, what's the relationship that humans could have with the land? Now, I could look through the Indigenous lens like we did before, but I can also see that the left-hand side is farming. Okay, that's a part of people's lives. They make their living off of working the land. They live off the land. The land is their sustenance. They sell their grains or whatever it is that if they're doing cattle or both, right? So, but not every child lives on a farm. So that means I might need to find other connections to where they might fit into this place. So when I look at this picture, I'm seeing a barren forest. I'm seeing logs that have been cut down and they're just laying there. They're just scattered across the floor of the forest. Here I have a bunch of logs that have been cut, and here I just have a clear cut, sort of just a mess, a mound of stuff. So an example of where I'm taking good care of the land. The other one could be argued that maybe I'm not. I'm not saying that clear cutting is a bad thing, because it has pros and cons. But if it's just left to its own devices, there's no follow-up, there's no reclamation, there's no replanting, that's not really good use of our land. If we're cutting down the Amazon forest, right, there's a huge component to the oxygen that we need in the world. So are we doing ourselves a favor or not? So again, it's talking about those pros and cons from both sides. So everything can have a positive and a negative. Can the students find that? Human relationships with land can be both positive and negative. I could come up with the Freyer model. I could also use a Venn diagram, right? So that would be another place that I could do something. Okay, we're going to go back to Ted again, who's going to talk about concept attainment. And this is a really important one.
This is just another surface strategy to help develop some of those individual concepts. You know, so Chris brought up the idea of relationship a lot. That's an important concept in this organizing idea. It's certainly in the outcome. There's some other ones that are also important. When we talk about relationships, we know we're going to be talking about cause, effect, and impact. And impact, as Chris was showing some of her examples, positive and negative. Relationships are also part of dependence, and we could quickly move that into interdependence. And one of the skills that are in this organizing idea includes comparing as well. So as Chris mentioned, knowing what a similarity and difference is going to help when you're doing car sorts or something and using those terms. I included some other concepts in there, such as conclusion, analysis, criteria. So they're things that that we do when we compare and contrast. For example, we draw conclusions when we do a lot of things. Even after a sort, what did you conclude? Well, we concluded that these things, what they have in common is that they've got all this. And so what those links are there are for little lessons that you may or may not want to do with your students, or use them as triggers for your students that give you a new idea of how maybe to approach introducing at least those concepts to the students. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to just, Chris, if you can just go to the relationship one as an example of how this might be organized. With each one, there's a little, if you're not familiar with the concept attainment approach, there's a little bit of a blurb at the front end of each slide. I hope these work better. Are they going to slide funny? Oh, we've got the same problem as yesterday.
That's okay. We'll make it work.
All right. So there is always the lesson steps are what to do to how to do them, but I won't go through that list for you. I'll just sort of verbally go through it right now. If you're not familiar with it, it's giving examples and examples of the concept that you want. So the concept that we're trying to establish is a relationship. So if we go to the next slide, Chris. So I've got an example, 2 pictures there, 2 things happening. Yes, that's an example of what I have in mind. And I wouldn't say me what it is right now, it's a relationship, but there's something that that group of pictures has in common that the next group doesn't have. So we've got a lightning and a forest fire, lightning and a person walking. What seems to be happening here? Let's go to the next one. Yes, again, we've got this time like it's a plant and a watering can. The no is a watering can and a balloon. So we had two groups of pictures. One was a lightning and a fire. That was a yes. A watering can and a plant. That's a yes. A balloon and a watering can is a no. Let's go to another example. We've got a clown and a happy face, and a clown and some kind of an ancient machine there. I would call it maybe an old telescope or a primitive telescope. So again, the forest fire and the lightning have something in common with the clown and the happy face smiling. What is it that they have? And of course, we're trying to develop, but there's a connection between those two things. So a relationship is simply a connection between two or more things. And we go back and say, what's the relationship between a lightning and a fire and a forest fire? Well, lightning can cause a forest fire. What's the connection between the clown and the happy face? Well, clown can put smiles on people's faces. So we're establishing some kind of a relationship with them. And so that's how this works. If you keep on going, it's because one thing I want to show at the end of the slide deck. So that's the concept attainment, gives examples or non-examples, gives me something gray. Which is the best example on that? If you go back to the other one, Chris, which is sometimes you can give them some gray and say, which is the best example of a relationship? And why do you think so? That way now students, when they talk about and argue their point, they're going to be talking about the attributes and they're going to be internalizing what a relationship is. Maybe they're both good examples. Maybe the relationship and the other one is very negative. Maybe some people just had an argument and it's a negative relationship. But so there's no right or wrong answer as long as the argument can be in terms of the attributes of what a relationship is, and an argument as to why it's included is not just going to focus on the attributes. So with relationship, I wanted to show the next slide because it moves on. Then relationships can be diagrammed with those lines. So here's the relationship here. If you can't see it very good, it's a group of people planting trees. So this is the question here. We got humans and nature. Is the relationship that humans help nature, or is the relationship that humans hurt nature? And explain why. Of course, there's always explaining why. And of course, what I would say is that humans are helping nature. This is an example of humans helping nature. That's the relationship. And because they're planting trees to help the forest grow. And next slide, please, Chris. So I introduced that line now because later on, when you do something like concept maps, kids know when they draw a line between two concepts, that line means something. So here's another example. What does this image show? Humans help, the relationship that humans can help nature, or is the relationship that humans hurt nature? And I think one more slide, Chris. Again, so now I'm doing it up here. What's the relationship here? What do we got? What are the two things in a relationship? A person and a dog. And what does the relationship seem to be? Why do you think so? And have students justify their thinking. And one more slide. I guess not. It goes into another one. Then once we start building those relationships, then we could start. Remember we talked about understanding being the relationship between concepts. And when kids could start doing that, then they could start making those connections and get a really deep understanding of the concepts and the understandings. So that's how a concept attainment exercise works. If you've never seen one, there's some of those for all those other concepts there that are kind of hidden. I'm going to just talk about criteria because that's a really important one. When you do the sort, you're using criteria. Chris says, on what basis are you making that decision? What it really is that where kids are using criteria. And criteria is actually a concept that is in the competencies. If you take a look at the competencies, which have been around for a long time, for grades 1 to 3, one of them in problem solving is that students will use criteria when making decisions. And so there's a concept attainment one there. You're going to see me use the word criteria in another example later on. So that's an example of that. Again, we're just at the surface level, just developing a deep understanding of those individual concepts. Thanks, Chris. You can move on.
Okay.
Oh, it looks like I'm still up for skills and procedures.
Yeah.
Okay, here we go. Again, at the surface level, what we want to do is isolate those skills. We know with language arts and math, those of you who are teaching that, and if you've taken a look at the science curriculum, we've got that skill, the verb, and then some stuff. What we want to do is get rid of the course content stuff and just isolate the verb and focus on the skills at the surface level. That means knowing what the skill is, What are the steps? If we're going to compare and contrast something, what steps do you do? If we're going to analyze something, what does that mean? How do we do it? And that's practice then out of the context of the course, or out of the course material, and I'll explain how we can do that in a second. Yeah, we can go to that slide, Chris, the next one you had. There's a list of all the skills and procedures for grade 2 living systems. You can see there's some repetition. Discuss is one that is a big one. It is really how kids can demonstrate, especially at this level, demonstrate their understanding. They may not be writers. They may not be able to represent or graphically show what they mean. It's probably discussing is the way they're going to really demonstrate their understanding to you. So discuss is an important one. Explain is very similar. You can see identify similarities, and further down in discuss and compare, which are similar basic things, right? Identifying similarities and comparing are similar things. So comparing and contrasting is also important in this organizing idea. So really discussing, representing, and comparing and contrasting are important ones to look at here. So if we go on, and go ahead, Chris.
I was just going to say, just to clarify for you as well, what Ted's doing here in bolding them is for not only the purpose of what it is that we have to meet, but remember that we're assessing the skills as well. The skills weren't written in the document for the teacher. They were written for the teacher and the student. So we need to make sure that the students understand that, so that when we assess them and we put them into, let's say, a project-based learning, or you've got a task that you want them to do, 21 hands are not going up saying, I don't know what you mean by represent. They should know that. Right now, is it going to be perfect to the first time round? Absolutely not. And they will learn as time goes on. And they're learning from kindergarten up to learn what the meanings of these words are and how they're going to use them. But that's going to be really important for us to remember.
And I may add, when you take a look at these key skills and living systems here, there they are again. When I said it's really important to try to introduce and teach these skills outside of the context of any of the curricular stuff. Because when you want to talk to kids about, let's make a representation of something, you want them to choose something as their first go at it, about what they're excited about, their passion areas. They're focused on doing the representation and focusing that, not trying to demonstrate their understanding of something. Same with explaining and discussing. And we know that they can do that not only in science, but in language arts, math, and all the subjects all together. So while sometimes there doesn't appear to be time, we can do those things in all our subject areas for practice, so that kids are competent in, because they are so valuable and important for them to use those skills to demonstrate their understanding. So there's a couple things we can do here. Oh, again, you'll see that with each skill, there's a concept, and it just helps when you're talking about the skills of the kids. When you're comparing and contrasting, you're looking for a similarity and difference. And in that list of concept attainment exercises I had, there's the concept development for what's a similarity and what's a difference. So then when you say we're going to learn how to compare and contrast today, which is how we're going to find similarities and differences, now they've got to connect. Now they understand what the skills, what the product is going to have to be. So that's why it's good to introduce the concept along with the skill. Next. One of the strategies that I use for teaching skills, especially their big ones, and Chris is going to introduce another strategy for comparing and contrasting that may be more appropriate for grade 2. It depends on your crew, but I just want to introduce this one, Chris, if you don't mind just clicking on the link. The direct teaching of skill strategy is just that. It's explicitly teaching the skill to students. Here's what it is. We're going to learn how to compare and contrast today, and here's how we do it. So on the left are teacher steps. So we want to make sure that you've got a good definition of the skill, and you're going to share that with the students, of course, but you want to make sure that it is, and define the related concept. A comparison, we know, is a similarity, a contrast is a difference. The highlighted words, you want to make sure the students are going to know about what those are before you even practice doing comparing and contrasting in this particular way. Then identify the steps. In this particular case, it's just you're gonna identify something, right? You're gonna identify the criteria. You're really gonna analyze two things if you're gonna compare them. So you're gonna analyze them on what basis? Is it color? Is it size? Is it shape? What are the criteria? And again, those are things that that we would have developed in that concept attainment model. When you analyze, that's essentially what you're doing. You're breaking it apart, investigating it, and finding things based on what you need by your analysis. So if I analyze this book, you can see it's got a square shape, it's got a certain thickness and so on. That's number one. I analyze it. I'm going to go have you scroll down to the bottom, Chris, because there is a bit of a chart which will help me explain. So after you identify your criteria on the left, then you go ahead and analyze it. If we were comparing the growing stages of spinach and sunflower, our criteria might be seed size, time to germinate, growth stage, maturity time, a lifespan. And then we observe, we put in what it is for spinach, for sunflower, and then we go across based on criteria 1, are they same or different? Criteria 2, are they same or different? And there's a little compare contrast scale because sometimes they're very different, somewhat similar. And at the end, we make a conclusion. Well, based on the information that we gathered here, the growing cycle of a sunflower and spinach are somewhat different or very similar, whatever the case might be. Now, this may be over the heads of grade 2, depending on where they're at, maybe something by the end of grade 2 that they can do. If you scroll back up, Chris, you can see when you do the direct teaching strategy, you break it down into those steps, and then you model it with the steps. You build the chart together, what criteria you're going to use, let's fill a chart in together, let's make our conclusion together, and so on. And then guided practice. But you can see how when you do this, you're going to choose something that's not course related because they're going to fumble around. They may choose 2 plush animals or 2 things that they enjoy or something they're very familiar with, so they can make a comparison contrast that way. But again, this is one strategy to use at the surface level to introduce the skill, to practice it, and to get kids familiar with it before you get them to use comparing and contrasting to demonstrate your understanding. So they're focused on the understanding and not how to compare and contrast. And I think Chris is going to share with you another way to compare and contrast that may be more beneficial at the grade 2 level.
So again, at surface level, one of the things that we even did with grade 1s, which would also be very appropriate here for what we're doing, because when we talk about how the relationships between human and land, for example. So what do living things need to stay alive? They talked about basic needs, right? And if I'm talking about if I'm helping my environment or not, I also need to be cognizant of what is a basic need for a plant. I need to know whether I'm damaging something or I'm responsible for looking after an animal. What is it that I need to meet for that animal? So in this particular case, and these are still surface level, this is still just getting the facts out there and making sure they've got it. Just because I now take a storybook or I watch a read aloud or listen to a read aloud and then ask them questions, doesn't again take it any further than just really got to some surface level. When I start to make connections with them, then we're starting to get into deep. And that surface, deep, and transfer, if I can just remind you that deep is your target. That's 85% of your teaching should be in that world, in the deep world. I've got to get the fact stuff out there, but it's what I do with that fact stuff that's going to be whether they get it or not. And that's where that deep section that we work in, that's where we land most of our teaching in, most of our questions in, most of the assignments that they're going to be working are all framed in that, in that area. So when I look at even using a Venn diagram, research tells us that a Venn diagram is one of the single strongest pieces of tools that we can use for having students demonstrate their learning and their understandings. Because I can't do it with just 2 items. You can't teach me a fact and another fact and then say, go at her. I got to know more than that. I've got to be able to connect the pieces that you've given me to make a decision about what's going to sit on the outside and what's going to sit on the inside. And the simplest way to do a Venn diagram, grab a hula hoop, get the kids out of their seat and put them on the floor, give them some cards or some titles of what you want them to do. Where would they put them? So in this particular case, we were talking about plant needs and animal needs. What do they need? And what do they have in common? Well, they found out that both of them need a shelter, they need food, they need air, they need water. But then animals, they can move, not moving over on the plant side, right? So again, it's the students can start putting some of these pieces together. And if they put it in the wrong place, when we ask them questions about explaining your thinking, tell me why you put this here. Then maybe they can talk themselves out, oh, wrong place, I need to move back, right? Reevaluate and do a little bit of self-reflection on it. So really, a Venn diagram is a great way for us to get a sense of where they're at, but also for kids to understand what they know and what they don't know. If I don't know where to put some of those words, maybe I don't even understand what the word is then, right? That's a good indicator for me and for the teacher then to know where I'm at. Okay, let's go here. All right, for some reason. So again, I could even ask the question, can human interaction in an environment be both positive and negative? That's grade 2. Could it be positive and negative? Let's go back to my example of tree cutting. Tree cutting can be positive if I'm looking for building more land that's going to be agricultural place for me to make my life's my sustenance out of. But the bad side of that is that I'm cutting down trees that are valuable in air. They're also windbreaks. They're also help with not letting areas become eroded because there's nothing to hold the moisture. The water runs off. But could that be both positive and negative? Absolutely. I can clear land to get more for living. And I can also get land, or I can also look at it from a negative side that I'm losing some valuable support or trees that I have for protection. So it's a pros and cons. It could live in 2 different worlds. But those are the pieces that we want students to be able to have. And these you can do, there's lots of these that you can do virtually that are editable. You can go in and change them. You can even do them with 3 if that's what you want. This is one that we had, tell me about it. What if I just wanted students to learn a particular skill that we've been working on? I have a plastic bag or a paper bag where I put a bunch of objects in there and I ask them to pull them out and describe. How would they describe them? What would be the steps that they would do? How would they make the difference? How would they describe the differences? So this could come out to texture. It could be a different plant or an animal. It could be as simple as 2 different stuffies. How would they describe those 2 different stuffies, right? So again, it's using that language that we want students to be really familiar with. That's a key piece. All right, now we're going to get into the really big stuff, the important stuff. I'll let Ted take it away.
As Chris mentioned, 85% of our time maybe is going to be in the deep world, and that's really the understandings world, working with those. And there are 4 of them in grade in this learning idea. And if you take a look at them carefully, they're all listed on the next slide here. Oopsie, scope, I guess. Did I have not have them listed?
There we go.
There we go. There we go. So these are the ones that are at the deep level. This is where we put the concepts together, and you can see the concepts visibly in there, right? In that first cusp, plants and animals can be affected by human behavior. So we spent some time with all the surface learning activities. Think about how many times that what Chris and I just said prior to this were examples of how these concepts have been developed: plants, animals, human behavior. I haven't gone to offspring yet. We'll get to that shortly. But similarities, didn't get stages yet, but in the whole thing, they will all show up. And we haven't introduced all those concepts yet because they're going to show up in some of the other activities we're going to use. That you'll see that Chris will stop and talk. Well, what is a offspring first before she gets in the activity? Before she even talks about plants, animals having similarity with offspring, she'll take time to say, well, you take a look and develop that idea. At the end of the day, the understandings are the deep portions there. And there's a lot of things you can do, a lot of learning approaches you can do that help to promote understanding. So this is really what they want the kids to walk away with, are these 4 things. The last one, I've reworded a little bit in the brown. It may sound a little bit more meaningful. And I think the idea of a relationship becomes a little bit more clear in the brown one. The one that's written the way it is in the curriculum reads: the ways in which individuals or groups relate to land, plants, and animals can influence cultural practices. It may be just the same meaning, but just a word a little bit better that might be easier to grasp and work with is the relationship that individuals or groups have with land, plants, and animals can influence their cultural practice. In that example, we've understood what does it mean to have a relationship. In other words, what's the connection there? What's that connection of people to land, their connection to plants, their connection to animals? What kind of relationship do they have and how that can influence? So that's why we worded that way. When you look at them, they mean the same thing, same understanding is there. So that's why that one appears in brown, in case you're wondering. Next slide, please, Chris. Concept maps is a really useful way to show those relationships. And I gave you an example of how that started to build with that relationship concept attainment exercise we did. If we go to the next slide, I'll just give you an example of how that can be helpful. For students to show their understanding, or for them to, begin tinkering with their ideas. We know that all these words that we have developed with students already: plant, human behavior, impact, positive, negative, and so on. I want to just talk a little bit about the impact one. It doesn't show up in the organizing, in the learning outcome, or the knowledge piece, but it does show up in the skills and processes. And I think, I'm not too sure what Alberta Ed means the same thing or not, but the skills and processes, one says, they describe or show examples, I believe, how humans can impact, they use the word impact, plants and animals. And so to me, that's a word that does show up later. It's a very useful word. And that if you're not too sure how to introduce that to your kids, there is a concept attainment one that talks about cause, effect, impact, positive impact, negative impact, and kind of assesses them out if you want to do that before you even get to this, because kids need to know what these are. Anyway, if you'll pretty soon find out whether or not they know these things, if they have that understanding, if they say, put these together in some kind of a relationship of a concept map. If they can do it and show their understanding and explain why they've done it that way, with those connecting lines meaning something that's logical and meaningful, and they can provide an example of it, they've got the understanding. So a concept map with these words may look like this. Next slide. Human behavior can be positive or negative, such as an example is recycling, an example is littering. Human behavior can have impacts on plants and on animals. All those words are connected. And then I could also ask, is that true that human behavior can be negative? How is littering negative? And then that's where you get those discussions, and to help students really demonstrate their understanding. They can do this and discuss it. They can't make those connections if they don't understand those individual concepts.
And if you can consider, or just can keep this particular concept map, small as it is, in mind, one of the videos that I'm going to share with you would be perfect to line up with this. So now would give them an opportunity to watch a video. There's no words in it, but can they now take from that video what they've learned and actually give you solid explanations and examples of what you're seeing here?
Discussing, as we showed on that checklist, is an important one. This is a really good time to slow it down, talk to kids what to discuss means. There's a link there to discussion checklist. Part of it's built out again are the competencies of the communication piece for kindergarten to grade 3. There's some things in there, plus some other things that are helpful and useful. Discussion doesn't mean to have to be the whole group. Discussion can be between you and the student. You could observe a discussion between just 2 kids, which might be more manageable at a young age to do that, or 3 people at the most. And I'm sure you're aware of that. There's that to help you with that. And the next slide just shows that a discussion isn't just sitting there and talking in a round table. We know that there are many ways kids can discuss things. We know what the gallery walk is, and then just sit in and say, here's what, after kids know what a discussion is, I'm going to watch and listen into your discussion to see if to see if we can see how well you're discussing this as well. And once kids get good at discussing again, or familiar with it, be more apt to provide you a discussion format to demonstrate what they know. Some of those, of course, you're probably familiar with the thinking routines, such as circle of viewpoints, see, think, wonder, and so on. So some of them are familiar to you, but the point is it's more than just having kids, again, put up their hand and involved in a class discussion, as generally sometimes when I first thought of discussion, that would get to my mind. So these are there to help you. Finally, as well, another idea that comes up is another way that you can help students demonstrate their understanding is representing. And again, it's simply putting what we know in a different way than it was originally presented. It can be a very deep strategy, depending on what you're representing, especially if you're representing an understanding. And we know that representing can take various forms. And again, a whole lot of examples for you. We're not going to get into those, but you're probably familiar with a lot of these on this sheet, or this checklist on the next sheet. But if you can, for example, say, have kids create a diorama that can demonstrate how humans can impact plants and animals. Right now, they're not telling you how, they're creating a diorama. It's a very powerful way for them to demonstrate that. And of course, you want them to help, there's going to be some explanation involved with it when they have their diorama or or a board game or a comic strip, whatever it is, mind map or infographic. Again, anytime you use these, it just again goes without saying they're kind of a skill-based thing. So when you do make a concept map, you're going to have make sure students at the surface level make concept maps with concepts they're already familiar with, and whatever those you would know your kids best what 3 or 4 concepts might be helpful for them to put ideas together in a concept map so they understand how they work and how to put them together. Chris, I believe you're up next.
So if we just start unpacking some of where am I going to get some of the tools to address some of these understandings? Like, what could that look like? So plants and animals can be affected by human behavior. And so we want to, now that we've kind of unpacked some of those concepts, now I want them to really can take those ideas that we've already talked about, and can they actually consolidate that thinking, and can they start making some elaborations on what we've learned? So this is that video that I was referring to. And again, you'll have the slide deck, so all of them will be active. This has got no words in it. Okay, this is really just a video that starts with man's very positive appreciation of the environment. And as the time goes on, they find how man impacts it in a more negative way. So there are so many different ways that a child can come at this now to demonstrate what they've understood. So there's no one correct approach here because there's so much information in there. So that's one that I said, when you can remember that little concept map that we just opened up, that would be a great one to bring forward and say, we're going to watch this. And now I want you to go back to that concept map, and what can you tell me about it? How are you going to unpack this for me? So how is human interaction positively represented in the video? Where did I see it be negative represented? And what could be some influences? Like what are some long-term effects maybe? How could I fix it? Because we're going to get into recycle, reuse, the 4 R's, right? That's part of what they're going to learn here. But again, it's not just about what's positive, what's negative. If it's negative, what am I going to do about it? Like, let's go a little bit deeper than that. So again, a symbol that they should be familiar with, right? And we can just ask them, have you ever seen it? Where have you seen it? What does it mean? What do we do with it? How does it help us when we're putting our garbage together? Like some kids will say, we don't do anything. Like we just throw everything in one bag, right? Then we have a conversation about how does that help our environment? So again, it's that opportunity to get into the 4 R's. You've got some videos here. I personally am not a stand up and deliver, put stuff on the board. I'm more of a let's investigate, find out what we can get out of something first. And then if there's something missing in our understanding, then let's go back and unpack it and find out what we're missing. So I might show them these 2 videos here and see, what did we learn about the word reducing, recycling, reusing, and repurposing? And these will come back again in another organizing idea. This is not the only time they're going to see it. So if I can really get good at it here, then when I bring it back again for the next visit, then we can really start to dive even deeper into it. So again, this is just some sources that you could use then for information to move.
We live on a wonderful planet.
Whenever we embed, we automatically turn them on as soon as we change slides. These particular posters that were put in here have some meaning behind them, right? They talk about connect with national parks. What's so big about a national park? Like, who really cares? What do national parks offer? What is the purpose of them, right? And how does that work with human impact in land? Is that a good thing, a bad thing? Why do we even have them? So again, just the words that are on here this isn't just for look, this is also to really unpack what's there. And you could divide the kids into 3 groups and they each get a different one and they start unpacking. How does that influence what we've just learned? Or how does that help me to solidify that we do good things, or that we need to do more good things, right? Those different pieces. There's also a little book called The Adventures of an Aluminum Can, and it will come back again in another organizing idea. But this is a great one. Again, you read a story about an aluminum can, and where does it go? And what happens to it? And we talk about, if you're talking about the 4 R's, this is a great way to unpack their understanding and put it maybe in a lighter way of doing it. So how could this little book lead to maybe even a culminating project? What about if they walked around your schoolyard? Is your schoolyard really neat and tidy? Are there evidence that there would be garbage around? Is there evidence that there's tons of things that could be recycled, but they're not? They're just sort of hanging in the garbage cans. Going for a walk outside and just take an inventory of what's around your school is a great way to do that. So again, I have those options in there as just ideas to unpack. Plants and animals share similarities with their offspring. Now, some of these pieces, the way some of the understandings in this one with the new rewrite, they kind of, I feel like they got a little bit disjointed. It's like we kind of jump from one to another. But what we're talking about here is plants and animals have cycles, and we are born, seeds die, we put new seeds in. Same thing with animals. Animals have a life cycle as well. And so when we start talking about this, we're not getting knee deep and really super into human reproduction, nothing like that. But what we are trying to get them to realize is there are similarities between their offspring. So maybe they have, they are a very strong relationship to one of their parents, right? They have some features that people say, oh man, you look like your mom, or you look like your dad, right? And they might say that, oh, somebody says that to me, or they say, I look like my grandpa, or I look like my uncle. The only caution I have for you, and it comes up on the next slide, is know your kids well, right? Because some children may not have a family, they don't have a parent that was their natural biological parent to make that conversation happen. So you just need to know, or maybe you've got some children that are in foster care, right? We just need to make sure that we're cognizant of when we ask the question, that we have a way for them to find their way in this as well. So we could just show them this. What do we know about, what do we see? Like, how do we see these animals? They're baby animals, they grow up, they have some things that look the same. A pig looks like a pig, right? We don't necessarily look at all the different aspects of it, but there's some resemblances for sure, right? We could even talk about twins. Maybe you've got some twins or triplets in your class, and that's always a great conversation. So what do you notice about the features of a parent and its offspring? Sometimes it's coloring, sometimes it's size, sometimes it's, I see here that the dad doesn't look like it, but the mom sure does, right? They look very much like the mom. So again, there's some common features. And we want to talk about what is a feature. When we talk about what are common features, first of all, you better define what a feature is. I need to know what that means. Sorry, I'm having problems today with my mouse here. So what are some features of animals? What do animals have? They have feet. They might have a tail. We don't have a tail. We're an animal, right? But let's just talk about animals. Let them pick a pet. Let them pick a familiar animal they know. What are features? What are distinguishing characteristics of an animal? So that they start to learn what features are. So they have hair, they have skin, they have nose, they have ears, eyes, so do we, right? We have feet. There is a couple of sites that I found for you that are royalty free that you can access as well. This is one of the posters that comes off of there. So again, it's not like I have to recreate the whole world, but maybe I want to give them some samples of what features might be. So this is a feature, this is not a feature, right? We do that whole concept attainment thing again. So here I have what it is for a bird, for a cat, for a fish. Looks very different. And they come from, the source is down here, but the source is called Sparklebox. I'll show you the link in a minute. Sparklebox has endless amounts of science, also math, but endless amounts of science resources on there that you can use, such as things like this, right, that the kids can borrow. So now maybe that I've done one together with the animals, now we say, can you devise one of these for a plant? What are some features of a plant? What do all plants have, or most plants have, right? So again, they have that conversation. So plant features are at the bottom, but I don't have to show them that. Maybe they want to brainstorm with a partner, and can they demonstrate that they understand what a feature is and that they can actually identify them for a plant, even though we didn't talk about that yet. What features do you have in common? We just talked about that. So know your students, be careful what you ask and to whom, just being aware of that. How do we obtain features like our parents? What's a life cycle? I'm big into Disney. That's just me, but Circle of Life, great song, great thing for them to sing. Also very meaningful to what we're doing, right? We want life cycles. What does it mean to have a life cycle? What is a life cycle? Is a life cycle for a human the same as a life cycle for a plant? Are they? So plants and animals have certain patterns and stages in their development. So we would unpack maybe an example. So I personally did a case study, and I used a case study of the bumblebee. So I'm looking for how can I teach children about the cycle of an animal so that once they understand one, I'm going to now ask you to make some choices. And then I'm actually going to ask you to compare the animal that you chose and the one that we did together. What were the similarities and differences in their life cycle? Were they exactly the same, or were they very different? Maybe I took one that had an egg. Maybe this is a live birth, right? So there's some differences there. But that's how we want to get them. That's where we want them to go. So one of the books that we also had about, is this a living thing, has a section on growth and change in it. So just a very superficial, we're not getting in deep into human reproduction, anything like that. We're not having to get too detailed about any of the animals, but definitely we want some language and some terminology. So this is the case study. And I've given all the materials that I used are in there as well into the folder if you want to use it. But I choose the bumblebee or the honeybee for a reason. And because pollinators are so much in demand right now, we need pollinators. We are seeing that we have a decline in some things. We need pollinators to keep our plants going. And there's such a decline in pollinators. So we learn about the bumblebee or the honeybee. And so we go through the whole process. I have a huge foldable. For those of you who've worked with me over the years, you know I'm big into foldables. I made a life-size foldable, which covers the entire grade 2 cycle. And it just does it through the honeybee. And we learn about the honeybee, and we learn about all the different things that happen in a hive. And we learn about how that life cycle happens. And what is it that happens? And what is the purpose of the queen? And why is the queen the only one that's the size that she is? And all those things. So then if I say to you, you know, Diana, Ted, I want you to pick your own animal and let's see what kind of life cycle they have, you could start to make some connections between the one you've just learned about and make those similarities and difference conversations happen. So again, we talk about even what are the life cycles? What does it look like? What does it happen? What is happening in the hive? How do I know which one turns out to be a queen? How do I know which one turns out to be a worker? Blah, blah, blah. Kids are fascinated by that. If you have somebody that raises bees or has hives that you can go see, that's even better. Like, take them out there. But again, there's lots of different connections that I've made in here that you can use if that's what you want to use. It's just an idea. It's just a suggestion. You could pick something that you are more interested in, right? So if bees disappeared, what would happen if bees disappeared? What if man didn't have any place for the bees to go? So they just disappeared. What would happen to the earth? Pretty significant answer to that. So that's something that we have the kids investigate. And then we talk about, how can I make sure that I can help save the bees? What's my role? So that would be kind of my culminating. How can you help? Now that you've learned something, you know what they need to live. You know what it takes to be a good steward of the land. How are you going to make that work? Right? So again, this comes from that same book about what happens if the bees were to disappear. So there are possible case studies. You could do a hen, butterflies, you could do frogs, you could do robins, sunflowers, beans. I mean, beans are common. We've done those before. A lot of these come directly from Sparklebox. They already have the cycle in there, but really I would want students to choose what's your interest, or maybe they pick their own. You give them the option to pick their own of what they're going to do and what they're going to explore. So again, do I have an option then to show you what I've learned between bees and, let's say, frogs? Maybe I did frogs, right? So what did I learn about frogs? What did I learn about bees? What were their commonalities in their life cycle? And what were the unique differences between them? Okay, don't have a queen frog, so clearly there's some differences there. I've also included for you sort of a summing up my thinking. Again, sometimes I use this where I may put a word in the center, and now I ask the students to unpack this for me. What have I learned, right? What have I got about this from the center point or center word that we put in there? What have I learned? So it's a way for me to just get a double sense of how well they're performing. And then individual groups relate to land, plants, and animals can influence cultural practices, or, as Ted said, the relationship individuals or groups have with the land, plant, and animals can influence the cultural practices. And hence the reason I showed the video that I did at the beginning with the land acknowledgement. So I'm going to focus a little bit less on other things and look more a little bit on Indigenous, because again, people were saying we don't have a lot of resources for that. I'm not sure what I would use. So here's an example. Sacred relationships is part of a series. We're going to see a lot of that later on in other organizing ideas, but that talks directly about what is the Indigenous worldview of the land. What is the most important part of the land to our Indigenous people? And you'll find that that's water. Why is it water? Why is water so important? And why does it hold the sacredness that it does? The story of Mother Earth. Why do we call it Mother Earth? Where did that come from? And this is, again, another short little video from the same person that opened it up. And then connecting the spirit of Mother Earth. What does that mean? And how does that get reflected in my beliefs as an Indigenous person in the cultural practices of the land? How does that make a difference? So this would be one that you could use from that lens, and you could use the Indigenous worldview and have.
How was our Mother Earth?
And unpack that with the students. Okay, Ted, do you want to talk about scientific methods?
Really briefly, I'm looking at the time and it'll just be really brief.
Yep.
I'm not too sure if my slide is in there or not. I don't know if I made it in time. If
Nope.
not, okay, we'll talk about both scientific methods and computer science. Scientific methods, what grade 2 scientific methods really outlines for you. That slide's not there. We'll have it in there on the recording slide that you'll get later. But it really outlines the investigative process from asking a question, making a prediction. They use the word there, gathering the data by observing, recording data. Analyzing is the word that's in grade 2, making a conclusion, and then discussing that. So those things are all in the scientific methods. We have someone with us, not Janet Bell,
Nicole Lamro.
Nicole Amaro, right, who will be, has a video that, and she'll have one, she has one for grade 1. She doesn't have one for grade 2 ready. She wasn't able to get that done for today, but there'll be a video in it that unpacks scientific methods for you. And then at the end of the day, what we're looking at is you can't really just introduce how to conduct an investigation and just walk away from it. We're going to show along the way as we go through these sessions how you can introduce that process of investigation into living systems, how you can integrate it into the other organizing ideas and so on. So that's coming up. Similar thing will be happening with computer science. With this one, Janet Bell, she is starting it. There are a few people helping us out with this one. There will be again an unpacking session for computer science. At the primary level, it's not working with computers and programming. It's working really at the basic level of making instructions at this level, following instructions. What are good instructions? What happens if the instructions are wrong? In other words, how do you debug and things like that? So it's really working with those concepts at this level in primary science. Don't think, oh my gosh, I'm teaching computer science, I don't know how to code. That's not what grade 2 computing science is about. But you may have some more information to add about that.
So with the computing science, you're going to find it, and you might want to just make a note of that for yourself. You're going to find it in 2 places. The computing science will be unpacked by grade. So there's an overview of what does kindergarten look like in computing science? What does it look like in grade 1? What does it look like in grade 2? That will be found in your introductory session 1 folder. And it will be slotted in under a little mini folder inside there that's called computing science. And when you open it up, it'll click it on by grade. So that'll be the overview of what is computing science. Then the second piece that will happen is that Ange Deering is going to quickly create for you, and we'll pop these in for you. She's going to do them by the end of this week. A 10-minute slot on what does computing science look like in grade 2 living systems. What could I do? What would it sound like? So you'll be able to go into your grade 2 today's folder, and you'll find a little section there called scientific method, and you'll find one in there that's called computing science. So we'll always embed those in there because it's not a one-off, like Ted said. It's not like, oh, did it one and done and we're good. It's ongoing. It's continuously ongoing. So we will include those in your folders so that you have access to those as well. Okay, and our final one would be assessment. Do you want to talk about that, Ted? Oh, you're muted.
I did it again. I know it's getting late, so I want to be quick with this. If you can go to the next slide, I think, and maybe one more after that. These again are the skills and procedure statements in the curriculum. These can be used for assessment if you want. Because when you think about it, when you discuss ways for plant and animals while interacting in various environments, you're going to give them a new context and say, in this context, how can we respect the plants and animals while interacting here? Or it may be a surface level thing. If it's pink, we're going to go out in nature. What are the ways, what are we going to do to respect plants and animals? It could be a recall thing or so on, depending on how you phrase it. When we take a look at representing life cycles of animals, that could be, that's very much a surface one, right? They're using a skill of representing to show one thing, not a connection, but just the life cycle of plants and animals, the life cycle of this, life cycle of that. So very surfacey. So you start connecting, like comparing two life cycles together. That's when you start getting deeper. I've highlighted the blues. Those blues can all be surface or deep, depending on what you do. If you've done some activities and your question is going to have basically, after you discuss it and you've learned about it together, and on a quiz you ask them, in class we did this, what were some of the positive, negative impacts of human behavior on plants and animals? That's going to be purely recall, and that's not deep. It's deep when you give a new context to these blue situations and then ask them that question. Like Chris did with the bees. Here's how the bees work, okay? And here's what's happening in this scenario at this animal shelter. Let's do a video on an animal shelter. After you view this animal shelter now, what are the positive and negative impacts of human behavior visible in this video? So it's making sure you ask that question in the context of a new content, right? In order to make it a deep kind of assessment for yourself. I'm not going to go any further than this with assessment. We'll talk about more in the next session as well, because we're running a shorter time here. So Chris, unless there's something you want to add, you can keep going through this. We'll be fine.
Okay.
We will cover this part as well. So
Okay,
we will cover it in the next section though.
So you have sections on resources in here as well. And so this is that sparkle box. So when you come in here, you can click it on and you can type in at the top science or math, whichever one you want to go into. And then again, you can search by topic, like features, for example, animal features, plant features. But I've also given you additional videos. So these might be, I've taught something for 2 days. I just need a fresh way to come back and review it. So maybe I take a new video. And every video is going to offer just a little bit of something different in it, right? So what did we learn that was new? So these are the sections of resources that you'll have available to you. And these are the books that we have found so far that have been really good for what we're working on right now. This Living and Non-Living Things works well all the way up to grade 3, and it's called a compare and contrast book. Has a teacher's guide that goes with it as well. In addition, in your folders, you will find a rubric for scoring if you want to do a common assessment. And what we've suggested to groups that we've been doing the science in person with is maybe in your divisions, you want to have a conversation about, we could all use this so that we're using the same kind of an assessment through science, just as a starting point. But again, this is just an option, not suggesting that's the only way that it can be done. So you will then, I'm going to stop the recording and I'm going to just ask a couple of questions here. I don't want to put people on the spot if we're recording.